In what ways has your relationship with God been shaped by what you inherit from your ancestors? In what ways has your relationship with God been shaped by what you inherit from your ancestors? I imagine for some of you, many of you, there may be some very positive, good things that you can say about this. For example, having a parent or a grandparent or an uncle and aunt who is a role model for living lives of deep faith and integrity, of devotion. How many of our ancestors would have been able to sing with such prayerful devotion as we heard Rebecca? And that can really shape someone's relationship with God. Perhaps having family traditions of life-giving faith has helped you to have a life-giving relationship with the living God. We can inherit wisdom, we can inherit faith and love and strength from our ancestors, acknowledging all of our humanness and capacity for making mistakes, but that there can be a really life-giving inheritance that we have. And this includes our spiritual ancestors, regardless of our genetic lineage, the kindred spirits who came before us, who are part of who helped to make the communities that we draw life from and we belong to. At the same time, I imagine that for some of us in this room, there may be some challenges involved in this question of how our relationship with God has been shaped by what we inherit from our ancestors. Perhaps you've had to contend with family traditions that weren't so healthy. And maybe that include harmful uses of religion itself, centered around fear or judgment or condemnation or delusion, or any of the, unfortunately, many ways that religion can be abused. So this can complicate our relationships with God. And we may have been on a journey of unlearning and discovery in our own spiritual lives. Perhaps, for example, discovering that God is not like an abusive father, that the living God is beyond whatever idol people can worship in God's stead. Or perhaps there have been other unhealthy family inheritances that unfortunately you've had to contend with, regardless of whether they're tied with religion. And maybe God or Jesus in your life has been really important in finding healing and freedom from those things. For example, experiencing God as a source of unconditional love and support, where one's parents were not. This can be a very powerful and healing experience. And so I hope you see how rich a question this is to explore. In what ways has our relationship with God been shaped and is being shaped and perhaps will continue to be shaped by what we inherit with our ancestors, from our ancestors? So we're often, I think, hardly even aware of what all we've inherited from our ancestors, for good, for ill, for neutral. And we may not be entirely aware of what all we are accepting or rejecting from our inheritance. And this is, part of what good therapy can help us with. What are we forgetting? What are we denying? What are we needing healing from? What wounds are we perpetuating ourselves? What's helping our well-being? What are we leaving behind? What are we carrying forward? So however much we're aware of all of this or not, the fact is, I believe, that our ancestors are indeed present in meaningful ways, maybe more ways than we are aware of. And that we do indeed have active relationships with what all we inherit from them. good, bad, and neutral. And it's also true that God is very much in the mix here, and that our relationships with God are deeply involved in our relationships with what we inherit from our ancestors. And you can see this play out in how many individuals and communities relate with God and experience God and speak about God. And you can see this play out in the biblical testimonies about God, which are these epic multi-generational dramas that explore not only the blessings that people inherit, but also the curses that can be passed down from one generation to the next. These triumphs, catastrophes, breakthroughs, wounds, resentments, reconciliations. On the biblical stage, which is, the Bible really is an ancient soap opera. We don't give it enough credit for that. There's a lot of drama, and a lot of bad behavior. And the biblical scope sees things from more than one generation. This big scope, more than one lifetime. So you see one generation after another wrestling with what they've inherited from the last, wrestling with God. That's what Israel means, those who wrestle with God. Wrestling with each other, wrestling with how to live well in this world as flawed creatures that we are. And in the midst of this, the Hebrew prophets in particular, we also, I think, don't give them enough credit for how unrelenting they are in explaining their people's current troubles and sufferings as being consequences for not only their own bad behavior and bad faith, but also the bad behavior and bad faith of their ancestors. An elder friend of mine who is Jewish and converted to Christianity and has a terrific sense of humor. She likes to say about the Bible, nowhere else in the history of the world has a people kept such a thorough record of their mistakes. And so remember this the next time there's some controversy over teaching about the mistakes of our ancestors. If there's a controversy about teaching about the history of slavery or of racist laws in the United States, being honest and accountable for our moral shortcomings and the damages that these have caused is a deeply faithful and wise thing to strive for, as hard as it can be. And our does include our ancestors, because we all inherit more than we may care to admit from our ancestors. So the latest research on trauma shows that even trauma can be inherited. I mean, it can be passed down through behavior, of course. Like one generation who has unresolved trauma can cause trauma for the next generation. But it also can be passed down genetically. Believe it or not, if a mouse is trained, these poor mice, and you aren't allowed to do this with people, but anymore, thank God. So these poor mice, they introduce like a scent, a particular smell, and then they give them a shock. And they introduce the scent and they give them a shock, poor mice. And then they learn to associate this, whatever that smell is, with, something painful is going to happen. So then when they just give them the smell, these mice then get into this fear response of, oh no, something painful is going to happen, regardless of whether then the shock. So they've been trained to associate this smell, this neutral thing, with something bad. The offspring of those mice, when they experience that scent, will have the same fear response, even though they haven't experienced the pain association. And that's true for the grandchildren as well. And there's some, like adaptive reason for this, right? Because then one generation may not have to learn the hard way. But this also means that kind of trauma can literally be passed down through the genes. So I've learned this from this really wonderful book called My Grandmother's Hands by a psychologist, Resmaa Menakem. And it explores how inherited trauma is manifest, particularly in race relations in the United States and in the lived experience of various folks in the U.S. And part of what I really appreciate about this, about his approach, is that importantly, it's primarily for Americans of African ancestry. He also emphasizes the importance for those of us with European ancestry to reflect on the traumatic experiences of our ancestors and how that may have been passed down as well as inflicted on others. So just think about, when you feel ready to, but just how many centuries of war have been visited upon the European continent. Reading history is not for the faint-of-hearted. And famines and persecutions and upheavals and, what's our own family's history in the midst of all of that? Consider, too, that the science of psychology has clearly shown that there's trauma in not only being a victim of potentially violent circumstances, but also being of the perpetrator of that. Like that causes moral wounds. And so how has this all been passed down and to the present generation? How has that affected the well-being of our own souls? And we may not be able to be fully aware of all of it, but the more we can be aware of it, the better. And this is all true in addition to the wonderful things we've inherited from our ancestors. This tremendous resilience of our ancestors, which is also our inheritance. The gifts that help them to survive and thrive and adapt and overcome. And this is also really important for the possibilities of healing in our present generation. So there's a psychological dimension to healing, there's a physical dimension to healing, and I really recommend Menakem's book for all of this, and it'd be a good book study, by the way, for us to do, now that I think about it. Because then he has exercises to do in groups, and like reflections, and really like prayerful reflections. But there's also a spiritual dimension to healing. And I can tell you with confidence that an important way that God can be at work in our lives, whoever we are, wherever we are on life's journey, can be in helping us to receive healing from some of that pain that we've inherited from those who have come before us, as well as to claim all that is life-giving and loving from what we inherit, and to fully claim that as well. So this has been my personal experience, and this has been the experience of many whom I've been able to accompany as a pastor. And this is a common theme in the testimonies of wise people through the ages, including the testimonies in the Bible. The Bible contains not only this wrestling with the painful legacies of sin, but also clear testimonies of how people can find healing and restoration with God and with each other, so that we don't need to inherit strife. We can inherit instead everlasting life. I think it's so interesting that it is inherit everlasting life. Inherit everlasting life. That's what Jesus literally says, to inherit everlasting life. So this is the gift that Jesus embodied. He embodied the divine power of love that interrupts the cycles of his people's harmful inheritance and pulls from the depths of their history the fruits of his ancestors' authentic encounters with God even as he ushered in a new and a powerful manifestation of the living God on earth. And the gift that Jesus embodied and embodies is a gift by grace that we can receive, ever new, every generation, with open hands, as we resolve to turn our hearts away from the powers of sin, however that's manifest in our lives, and towards the warm embrace of our holy Creator, of such power and of such love, who meets us as we are and helps us on our healing journey. And for this, I give thanks to God. So thanks be to God.